Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Narrating Cold War conference. My name is Yujia, and I'm with School of Communication and Film, Hong Kong Baptist University. Here we got Mattia. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Assistant Professor at the Academy of Film, and I'm here to support and assist our chair today.
Thank you, Mattia. We had a full schedule in the past 2 days. I think all presentation, which were done by faculty members and senior scholars, were pretty amazing, and questions from audience were actually thought-provoking. I believe today our student panel will be no difference, actually. Okay, let's get into our first graduate student panel. The topic for this panel is Cold War science and technology. Cold War can be considered as the trigger for science and technology booming. A very classic example is the space race. The wireless headset we are using today, the LED lighting we are seeing in this room, and even freeze-dried food such as the instant noodles, other technology and science advancements from that time. So in this panel, we are having papers that will be presented from historical side of the Cold Wars, also as well as the science side and technology side. We got 3 wonderful research students who would like to share their thoughts and vision on these issues. Let me introduce them. Our first presenter is Amartya Sharma. He's an undergraduate student at the George Washington University in DC. He studies in the Politics and Values program. Our second presenter is Angie Hasham Abudo. I think she's not here yet, but she will be with us soon. She's a sea power researcher that focuses on China. Also, she's an alumnus of Harvard University. Her research focuses on international relations. The third presentation will be given by Tom Wilkinson. He is a graduate student at the University of Auckland. His research preliminary focuses on American responses to the space race from 1957 to the mid-1960s. I think we have 3 speakers, so each of the previous presenters will have a little bit longer, around 20 minutes to present. After all the presentation finished, we will open the floor for questions, but you can also put your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation. Okay, let's welcome Amartya Shamar, and his topic is Cold War Redux, who ended the Cold War and squandered it, the Cold Peace.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today, and thank you to the university for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all and to present this essay. So my paper is titled "The Cold War Redux: Who Ended the Cold War and Squandered the Cold Peace." In this essay, I hope to examine the history of the Cold War, and in particular, the ideological battles and how those hard-won victories were arguably later squandered. The first part of my essay examines the historical dynamics between the American president, Ronald Reagan, and the USSR's Mikhail Gorbachev nearing the end of the Cold War. And then the second part of the essay will examine how the peace dividend was squandered by Western powers, as I argue, and I use the framework of the end of history debate as popularized by Mr. Francis Fukuyama's book of the same name, and the immutable power of liberalism and democracy in shaping the future. Michael Mandelbaum, he is a political commentator and professor of foreign policy in the United States, who's really defined the common debate historically as figures of hope to argue who in fact is most responsible for ending the Cold War. Mr. Mandelbaum, as he's written, did Ronald Reagan really bring down the wall with a single speech, or was Gorbachev a leader, sort of unlike his predecessors, willing to allow for liberal reforms? And I, in my thesis, argue that the USSR really met their fate primarily because Gorbachev loosens his grip on the Eastern Bloc, as well as the revolutions led by figures in the satellite states for further democratization in those countries. And the argument that I make in particular is that it's quite cyclical, right? As Soviet communism grows further in unpopularity in the satellite states, revolutions are ignited, compelling Gorbachev, of course, to attempt to introduce liberal reforms, and then allowing the floodgates to really open for more revolution. That is, of course, I don't mean to, in that argument, underscore the presence of an aggressive American foreign policy, particularly during the 1980s, in bringing an end to the Cold War. The expansion of the covert arms program in Afghanistan, I think, is a particular example. Data shows that the USSR ended up spending about 13% of their GDP on the military budget at that time. So really showing the impact that an upscaled, ramped up, aggressive American foreign policy had on the response that the USSR gave. And so that impact is certainly there. But my primary argument is that the fall of the Soviet Union, again, came primarily from implosion within the Iron Curtain. Joseph Nye, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, writes that although in theory, communism aimed to establish a system of class justice, the Soviet Union maintained domestic power through a brutal security apparatus involving lethal purges, gulags, broad censorship, and ubiquitous informants. The net effect of these brutal measures was a general loss of faith in the system. So Slavenka Draculic, in her famous book, How We Survived Communism and Even Laughed, made a similar point, referring to her time in living in what was then called Yugoslavia. And she writes that we simply were not ready to accept a deteriorating standard of living in the name of an ideology we didn't believe in. This was how the communists lost, she writes. Further, William Hitchcock, another political commentator, remarks in his book, The Struggle for Europe, that hence it's wrong to, he says that it's wrong to rob the Eastern Europeans of their place in history as authors of genuine revolution. In 1989, thousands upon thousands of people in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, then Czechoslovakia, and Romania, motivated by a simple yearning for personal freedom, pulled down the ramparts of the Eastern European police state, Hitchcock writes. So really surmising arguably the true fuel behind what would then bring down the Iron Curtain in the USSR, was that from within, particularly, of course, from the satellite states, this incredible desire for change, for further democratization in particular, as well as a change in general economic agenda and policy. And so in response, of course, Gorbachev, unlike many of his predecessors, perhaps closest, however, to Khrushchev, introduced, for example, he introduces his Glaznost, which opened the USSR to information, a consultative government, and even exchange of Western goods and ideas. Of course, Gorbachev believed that adopting liberal ideas of free speech and press would calm the USSR, particularly in a more egalitarian fashion, calm the movements for revolution. And of course, he does confront the same problems that Khrushchev did prior when he pushed for de-Stalinization, as it's known by many historians. But of course, once Glaznost let people say what they thought, many people said, we want out, representing that, again, that I think the cyclical nature and the way in which the true, what really truly brought down the curtain was the dynamics from within. Another pertinent example, of course, is the previous Brezhnev doctrine that was implemented in the USSR, which of course had to do with labeling revolutions from the satellite states in favor of democratization as a fundamental threat to the USSR, and thus justifying the ease with which from central power could intervene in those satellite states. Gorbachev abandoned this, again, hoping to loosen the grip that had previously been placed on the Eastern Bloc. And so those two examples in particular, I think really heighten Gorbachev's response, diverging response from his predecessors to the growing calls for change. A specific example, of course, was in 1989, Poland began holding free elections, and in that same year, the Poland's Communist Party was defeated. And so while Gorbachev hoped to revive communism and its popularity by implementing more liberal reforms, he, of course, opened a window for Poland to oust communism entirely. The same can be said on the economic front. Gorbachev, his perestroika was an economic initiative that allowed, that was generally was hoping to invigorate market incentives in the Soviet Union. Perestroika, of course, legislated after the Chernobyl incident, which was in the 1980s, had a great impact on when then the wall would fall. But again, to that point, for Gorbachev, he really hoped that, and himself, himself said that he understood that profound transformations needed to be carried out in the economy, and a higher standard of living had to be ensured. But of course, as Professor Nye also writes, Gorbachev wanted to reform communism, not replace it, but his reforms snowballed into a revolution driven from below rather than controlled from above. And in trying to repair communism, he punched a hole in the system. Like a hole in a dam, once pent-up pressure began to escape, it widened the opening and tore the system apart. He goes on to write that the Soviet economy's decline in particular reflected the diminished ability of central planning to respond to global change. So while not only on a political and democratic front, there were also economic motivations to many of the revolutions from the satellite states that would bring about the fall of the USSR. Data even includes that by the late 1980s, only 8% of Soviet industry was globally competitive. And so it's difficult for a country to remain a superpower when the world doesn't want 92% of what it produces. And so to summarize, while the United States and President Reagan's administration and many of his predecessors as well in the United States, for the most part, did have an aggressive foreign policy towards the Soviet Union, it was the Eastern Bloc that rejected Soviet communism that really brought down the wall, and Gorbachev, who loosened the grip, which would only seek to further that trend. As Hitchcock mentions, Eastern Europe certainly deserves their place in history when discussing the end of the Cold War. And so on then to the second part of the essay, which is really then, how did the situation arise where Gorbachev, as Tom Parfit, another political commentator, writes, really became a persona non grata as a global statesman, particularly compared to Vladimir Putin, who is now in charge. He writes that, Andrew. Yeah, so he writes, Andrew Basevich writes in his book, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory, that today, almost 3 decades after the Cold War has ended, Western powers found themselves in a dilemma of their own making. They may have won the ideological battle, but squandered the hard-won peace. The United States has ended up with gaping inequality, permanent war, moral confusion, and an increasingly angry and alienated population, as well as, of course, one of the strangest presidents in American history, of course, referencing President Trump, who lost re-election last year. In the classic book, The End of History and the Last Man, Francis Fukuyama suggests that humanity has reached a moral and economic pinnacle, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The book elaborated on his 1989 essay, The End of History, where Fukuyama synthesized the philosophies and ideologies of Hegel and Marx, who envisioned human history as a progressive ladder from one economic system to another. He describes it as a dialectic between forces, particularly between egalitarianism and totalitarianism. So the main thesis of The End of History suggests that liberal democracy is the penultimate form of government, and that all other alternative forms of government ultimately have failed. While liberal democracies can certainly face setbacks and retrenchment of democratic ideals, Fukuyama argues the world system as a whole is evolving towards democratic institutions that are liberal and open in nature. Liberal democracies have been better able to manage stagecraft governance and economic development than other forms of societal organization, he argues. But if that indeed is the case, then how do we explain the current situation in the United States, arguably rising authoritarianism that can be pointed to, particularly as many have argued and theorized in the United States at our previous administration, and as well as rising authoritarianism in vogue around the world. So did history really come to an end, or was the news of liberalism's triumph perhaps over-exaggerated? Of course, many like Fukuyama argue that the suggestion never was that American style of democracy in particular would be the sine qua non of liberalism around the globe. And as well, he'd argue that there isn't a single model of democracy, but multiple that can exist, which certainly is the case when making a comparative argument. Thirdly, another counter to that, as posed by none other than our keynote speaker, Mr. Louis Menand, in his when he writes, Francis Fukuyama postpones the end of history in the New Yorker, that it may not be accurate to suggest that history will always move in a predictable, straightforward, linear manner. There may be retrenchments of liberal values from time to time, but the democratic project will continue unabated, as Fukuyama himself, of course, also argues. If totalitarianism does make a comeback in different guises in newly emerging democracies, it will be vigorously challenged by the democratic and parliamentarian ideals and values in local and international settings. And perhaps the examples previously mentioned in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and as early as the 1950s, throughout the period designated as the Cold War, are examples of that. Robert Kagan, a neoconservative commentator here in the United States, writes that the end of the Cold War led to two broad assumptions about economic and ideological determinism in the United States, and in particular, US foreign policy. Says that it was first an affirmation of belief in human progress, particularly rooted, of course, in Enlightenment values, and then in the linear progression of history. And secondly, a belief in working with autocratic states with patience and restraint. He writes that rather than confront and challenge autocracies, it's better to enmesh them in the global economy, support the rule of the law and the creation of stronger state institutions, and let the forces of human progress work their magic. And these beliefs have arguably fueled the rise of many of the undemocratic adversaries in the United States, the more autocratic national adversaries of the United States and her Western allies, unified in liberal democracy. While Reagan's principles stand against a common enemy may have contributed to the decline somewhat of the Soviet empire, the American presidents who came after George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama have faced a power vacuum abroad and an increasingly inwardly looking America domestically. And thus the working assumptions outlined by the end of history thesis, as enunciated, of course, by Fukuyama and later by figures like Kagan, have been significantly challenged, especially after 9/11, when critics rightfully and in line with rightfully and with a line of argument that can still be applied to US foreign policy today, criticized Fukuyama for declaring a premature victory for liberalism and democracy. Interestingly enough, Michael Mandelbaum, to return to him, calls the squandering of the peace dividend after the Cold War a mission failure of American foreign policy. Central to his argument on this front is the claim that Americans after the Cold War felt too emboldened and failed to realize the limits of their own power. After 9/11, the war on terror overstretched American reach in trying to police the entire world. Furthermore, Fukuyama himself would go on to criticize neoconservatism and the arguable failures of Bush-era foreign policy, though he did not renege on his original thesis entirely. Not having a singular external enemy and a cohesive foreign policy vision, American power post the Cold War, has been bereft in the world, perpetually on the move from one mission to another, and not unlike a benevolent empire, Mandelbaum argues. So while the neoliberal project of developing markets, trade, and globalization has been ascendant, inequality and racial strife domestically has been increasing. Whereas George H.W. Bush's Gulf War established American supremacy and its limits of constraint of power, George W. Bush's Iraq War after 9/11 seemed untethered, especially when Americans entered the Iraq War on controversial, at best, evidence of WMDs and prematurely declared mission accomplished. Thus, contrary to the original scenario predicted by Fukuyama, while he did not completely back off his thesis, he of course would later criticize specifically neoconservatives' efforts to impose democracy via preemptive wars and to pursue a never-ending war on terror history may have come roaring back with a vengeance, as alternatives to the American system of governance may arguably seem more attractive. And this certainly provides insight into how and or why the US arguably squandered the coal piece. In other nations, particularly America's adversaries, argue that we've got it all wrong, generally speaking, regarding democracy. And so in conclusion, interventionism and abroad, when coupled with economic collapse and growing inequality due to recent examples such as the housing market crash and the gaping equality exposed, the gaping in racial, socioeconomic, and class inequality exposed by the COVID crisis, especially in the United States, has clearly brought an end to the first American century argument. And despite populist appeals to make America great again, while populists may be happy to align with the old Soviet foe to beat out domestic and international enemies, that is, of course, in reference to the intervention by Russia in our 2016 and in our 2020 elections, it's not clear that Putin has any interest in advancing the American cause of freedom and democracy. If anything, Putin now feels the need to fill in a gap left behind by the overstretched American presence in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other places. Putin wants to rebuild, wants to sideline NATO in Eastern Europe, and with a rising power in China as a complement to Putin's reconstituted Russia, America seems increasingly vulnerable now on the global stage, going at it arguably alone and without its Cold War allies. Although our new president has tried to resolve his predecessors' mistakes, proclaiming that Western democracy, or to our Western democratic allies, that America is, quote, back, end quote. So another wave of populism at the ballot box may spell the end of American global power entirely. The 3 decades of cold peace squandered between isolationism and adventurism may have summoned the muse of history again. Thank you.
Thank you, Amartya, for the talk. I don't think Angie is here, right? So let's give our spotlight to Tom Wilkinson to deliver his talk on Sputnik 1 and American popular assault at the dawn of the space age.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone here. Thank you for coming along today. I hope this should be sharing properly now. So, perfect. Thanks for spotlighting that. So, on the 4th of October, 1957, humankind entered a new era. On that day, the Soviet Union became the first nation to send an artificial satellite to space. To modernize, Sputnik 1 is not a particularly impressive piece of technology. It was an 83-kilogram metal ball, which periodically beeped for 3 weeks, after which its battery died, and it only orbited the Earth for about 3 months. However, Sputnik's significance extended past its technical capabilities. It marked the beginning of the space race. How could the Soviet Union, with an opponent which was supposed to be technologically and scientifically behind, manage to achieve such a tremendous milestone? To American media commentators, this could only spell crisis. This gives rise to what historians today often refer to as the Sputnik crisis. That is, usually this encompasses the launch of Sputnik 2 later in that same year, but for the purposes of my research, I focus predominantly on Sputnik 1. The response of American commentators, in particular, comments like this one pictured, do indeed paint a picture of crisis, a nation that has been rocked by the unfathomable notion that maybe its opponent was not as behind as it had seemed. Furthermore, it raised the horrifying prospect that the nation's major opponent could cause serious damage to the United States with minimal warning or response. However, as those studying the Cold War, we need to be cognizant of the term crisis and reflect on the term, as its use can actually enrich and challenge our understandings of the Cold War world and the narratives we disseminate. In their 2017 paper, Crisis in Contemporary History and Historiography, Rudiger Graf and Comrade Jarasch note that crises loom large in historiography because they are generally more interesting than stability. Identifying particular events or periods as a crisis produces a narrative structure that reduces historical complexity and dramatizes historical experience. Essentially, then, a crisis period is an out-of-place event in the expected temporal sequence and is both preceded and succeeded by a sense of normalcy. Likewise, the idea of a crisis can be used to further explain historical developments. That is, events only occur in the historic record because of said crisis. This has a particularly important consequence for historians. Crises lend themselves well to the creation of and dissemination of historic narrative. With this in mind, the Sputnik crisis serves multiple functions. Firstly, it implies that the natural state of the early Cold War saw the United States comfortably ahead of the Soviet Union in all realms. Secondly, it posits that the crisis itself, the launch of Sputnik, pushed the United States in a specific historical direction. The direction, of course, depends on who we ask. Historian Walter McDougall, author of one of the earliest and most comprehensive histories of the space race, believed the narrative of the space race to be this: the United States, shocked by Sputnik's launch, completely transforms itself politically throughout the early years of the space age. The government reorganizes along much more technocratic lines in order to compete with its already technocratic opponent. For historian Roger Launius, formerly chief historian at NASA and a prominent space historian in his own right, Sputnik helped transform the American government into a more powerful, positive liberal organization, in spite of Eisenhower's own attempts to minimize the size and role of the US government. What these two narratives have in common, and indeed what Launius has identified in other works, is that the Sputnik crisis serves an important role in the much wider narrative of the space race. The crisis engendered by Sputnik's launch was the push that the United States needed to engage more fully in space exploration. This does, of course, culminate with the Apollo program and American victory in the space race itself. However, it's crucial that we turn a critical eye to the moment. These narratives that I've cited are typically institutional in their focus, looking at NASA, the American government, American politicians, and a lot of the time, what dominant media narratives are. Was the launch of Sputnik truly a crisis, or is this a distorted view of the past? Furthermore, was the space race as we know it the inevitable outcome of Sputnik 1, or were there alternative pathways forward? For this, we need to try to turn to public perception of the space race. There is limited but high quality work that has already been undertaken on this. Roger Launius in particular has mentioned public responses to the space race in his own studies of Sputnik and the Sputnik crisis. And what Launius recognizes is that the American public do not necessarily fall on the side of fear regarding Sputnik 1. The fear-based narrative that's often echoed in histories of the space race is one that appears to have been greatly influenced by political figures and media commentators, not by ordinary Americans. For the average American, in fact, space appeared an exciting prospect. Fellow historian Kim McQuaid reaches a similar conclusion in his own study. He argues that the crisis narrative is an inaccurate framing of the past, relying on elite constructions, not on what average Americans think. Sputnik, quite simply, was not scary for the average American in McQuaid's eyes. Citing polls taken at the time, McQuaid notes that there's a relative 50-50 split about the importance of space and the space race when topics regarding that come up during this time. It's predominantly American political elite, academics, military officials, and media organizations who are crucially shocked and scared by Sputnik 1's launch. With this in mind, I wanted to determine what members of America's public actually thought. To find out, it becomes necessary to turn to the evidence the Americans themselves produce, one example being letters to the editor. Letters to the editor are present in some format across magazines and newspapers throughout the time period. and it provides really valuable insight into how members of the public received and interpreted Sputnik's launch. That being said, it's important to acknowledge that these letters do not necessarily capture the full diversity of American opinion, and as such, the title of this piece, Sputnik 1 in Popular Thought, may be slightly misleading. Instead, these letters only capture the opinions of those who are most willing and able to write into their local or regional paper, and then of those individuals, the ones who subsequently have their letters published. A further layer of selection comes into play here because the only letters I was able to access throughout this project was determined by what had been digitized and was available from here in New Zealand. As such, there are 3 separate layers of selection, that is the writer, the newspaper selecting it for publication, and the subsequent digitization of said newspaper, that do implement the evidence that's available to us as historians. However, from what I was able to read, I was able to note 2 pretty major themes in immersion public correspondence that I want to refer to today. Firstly, we see Americans who reject the Eisenhower administration's own anti-crisis narrative, and although there were assumptions of Cold War consensus, these Americans don't quite agree on the correct responses to Sputnik. While fear certainly characterizes some of these responses and leans into this fear-based narrative, it does not necessarily mean a space race or even an arms race with the necessary outcomes. Secondly, we see members of the public who invoke contemporary issues such as civil rights into their conceptions of the space race, Sputnik, and notions of loss or victory. These Americans weave the 2 issues together into a narrative that focuses not on Soviet success, but instead on American failure, reflecting a conception of the Cold War world that is more, I think, domestic in outcome. Criticism of the Eisenhower administration's response to Sputnik emerged on 2 major fronts. Now, a major part of the Eisenhower administration's response was to diminish or dismiss the Soviet Union's achievement. Most famously, Eisenhower, when questioned by reporters, claimed that Sputnik presented not 1 iota of worry, a byline that ran through multiple papers and received a huge amount of criticism. There were constant denials from the administration and various officials that a space race was actually underway, and this refusal to congratulate the Soviet Union appropriately drew significant public criticism. One letter, written by New York resident Marion Hart, was sharply critical of the unsportsmanlike response of the United States to Sputnik's launch. As she says, like a sorehead baseball player, our morose comment is, "We was robbed." Hart did not particularly care that the United States had lost on the satellite front. Indeed, Sputnik itself is not a crisis to her. But the problem is the Eisenhower administration refused to acknowledge this success in any sort of appropriate or statesman-like manner. Her stance is echoed by Mrs. Herbert Voigt of Maryland, who compared Sputnik to her newborn daughter. For Mrs. Voigt, well wishes regarding the birth of her daughter only served to remind her that the United States had failed to congratulate the Soviet Union for its own new baby. In the eyes of these women, the American failure to congratulate the Soviet Union on Sputnik presented a sour grapes attitude that reflected quite poorly on the nation. No sense of crisis or frustration. Instead, the frustration comes through in the Eisenhower administration itself. In downplaying Sputnik's significance, the Eisenhower administration also sought to downplay and diminish military implications of Sputnik, something that also received a huge amount of pushback from American people. Sylvan Gotcha, a reader of the New York Times, penned this letter in which they argued that Sputnik was more dangerous in its implications for the future of our country than ever was Pearl Harbor. For Gotcha, Sputnik was not a military achievement to ignore or dismiss. Instead, it was one of the greatest threats to the United States to ever exist, agreeing then with political figures who had issued similar statements. Gotcha justified their argument by noting that Sputnik was not just a hit to American prestige, but also that a satellite of its kind could easily be fitted with an atomic warhead. Gotcha's fear of atomic destruction was they were not alone in this. Alan Klein, a reader of the Washington Post and Times Herald, held similar concerns. He believed that Soviet satellites could be used for espionage or chemical warfare, a deeply concerning issue to him. Now, despite the reassurances offered by the Eisenhower administration, these Americans did genuinely hold serious concerns over Sputnik's potential military implications, but they differ on their apparent solutions to this problem. Gotcha and Klein advocate some really completely different solutions to the Sputnik crisis, as they might see it. Where Gotcha argues that the United States ought to throw off the bonds of lethargy and complacency and urgently develop both satellite and missile technologies, Klein is instead urging that efforts to achieve global disarmament should be increased. Both of these opinions come from probably a place of fear and concern, but they represent completely different responses to the perceived realities of the Cold War world. Gotcha, in arguing for the United States to improve its technical and military base, is conforming to some of the ideas pushed by members of the defense industry and media organizations, and very much leaning into this, I think, traditional bipolar Cold War mentality. Realistically, Gotcha is advocating for an arms race. Should the United States continue to improve its weapons, so too would the Soviets. Klein's opinion, meanwhile, reflects his apparent faith in the post-war international order and tries to posit an alternative path forward. To borrow a term we've already heard at this conference, we could perhaps assert that Klein holds a planetary perspective of the Cold War, or at the very least of nuclear weapons and outer space missiles. And Klein's opinion is not necessarily coming out of left field. At the same time that Klein himself is arguing for these disarmament efforts in the newspaper, the United States was actually trying to push through stronger disarmament legislation at the United Nations. In particular, the American proposal called for international control of outer space missiles and urged the peaceful use of space. While the intentions behind these disarmament measures are debatable, the United States did not necessarily possess an outer space missile at this time, and the Soviet Union took great pains to point this out in their criticisms of the proposal. The attempt at using an international forum to advocate for peaceful relations was supported by at least one American citizen. Could this have been an alternative solution, perhaps, that prevents the space race and the associated missile race at its very inception? The other major theme we see emerging in these letters is the integration of civil rights into concerns about Sputnik. Now, while the Soviet Union launched its satellite in October of 1957, the United States had been contending with its own civil rights issues or civil rights crisis even for nearly a month, the racial integration of Little Rock High School. For those less versed in American history, the integration of Little Rock was one of the major civil rights issues of the 1950s, following the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the American Supreme Court in 1954 that was deemed unconstitutional for racial segregation to continue throughout American public schools. However, in 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, there was major pushback from Governor Forbes, including the deployment of the state's National Guard to prevent 9 African American students from attending Little Rock High School. This was met by the Eisenhower administration exerting its own power and deploying federal troops to instead ensure these students could attend. And realistically, Eisenhower, as is written by some, actually takes time off at the launch of Sputnik, specifically because he had been so stressed by dealing with Little Rock. This is why Eisenhower himself is actually away for the weekend when Sputnik is launched, and his response takes a few days before it's reported by the media. However, for some Americans, this Soviet success provided an actual backdrop for examining America's own failures. The United States was not the first to launch a satellite, not because the Soviet Union was better and this was some sort of crisis, but because Americans had failed to resolve domestic issues effectively. Halcott A. Bradley, a reader of the Washington Post and Times Herald, argued that the prejudiced president in the United States only served to destroy the nation's talents. Bradley was incredibly critical of the Southern attitude towards racial integration, noting that the satisfaction of having so-called race purity is appearing to be a terrible price to pay for ruthless annihilation, and yet we don't have an operational ICBM. For Bradley, racial issues and America's refusal to appropriately deal with them presented a very clear reason as to why the United States had failed to be first to space and even first to intercontinental ballistic missiles. Other letter writers agreed with him. D.E. Hughes, another reader of the Washington Post and Times Herald, directed his criticisms towards the nation as a whole, instead of just the South. Hughes sardonically claims that there was no need for a congressional investigation into the missile program, something being pushed by prominent Democrats at this point. Instead, it was incredibly obvious why the United States was behind. To quote, "The United States has been doing a bigger and more important job keeping Negroes out of school." Now, Hughes, much like Bradley, suggests that the Little Rock crisis and American attitudes towards race were one of the primary drivers for America's loss, its failure to be first in this scenario. That being said, it's important to recognize that their views do not necessarily represent all Americans. Those living in the American South posited a similar idea to these two letter writers, that is, civil rights played a role in the United States failing to be first to launch a satellite. But their reasoning is, as you can see from this slide, radically different. One letter in particular, sent to the Washington Post and Times Herald from Mississippian C.C. Smith, demonstrates a radically different conception of the world, one that we might look back on today as rather unhinged, but at the time, one that's definitely, I think, demonstrative of the fear and paranoia that does exhibit some or a lot of Cold War thinking. For Smith, the Supreme Court, the Soviet Union, and those in favor of integration were all working together, either willingly or unwittingly, to damage the United States. Smith claimed that the United States were beating the Russians at a lot of things, and he points to Little Rock as his example. To quote his letter, "We smashed them to pieces in much less time than they did Budapest," referring, of course, to the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which was brutally repressed by the Soviet Union. In this letter, Smith presents two key points. He conflates integrationists with Russians, seemingly implying that racial integration is actually a communist plot. And he also implied that the Supreme Court was working in Soviet favor, including his claim that the United States had only been in the business of tyranny since 1954's Brown versus Board of Education decision. Likewise, he makes this comment that chances our fellows had them beat years, but we were afraid to be ahead of the Ruskies. They knew our Supreme Court would declare ours unconstitutional if they did. Now, it's unlikely that Smith's view is particularly common and representative of a huge amount of people, but the sort of more paranoid or anti-Eisenhower administration in particular view of things is not uncommon. CJB, who writes into the Atlanta Constitution, expresses some similar thinking. He claimed that the Eisenhower administration, the Department of Defense, and others had been planning for the subjugation of the American South since 1954's Supreme Court decision. For this individual, fighting the Cold War and defeating communism was much more important than, to quote, the question of which party gets the Negro vote in the 1960 election. Much like Smith, CJB believed that integration and other civil rights issues were unnecessary distractions from the much wider existential conflict of the Cold War. Now, while he's not implying that the Supreme Court is on the side of the communists, he's certainly demonstrating a belief that the federal government is trying to overstep its boundaries and authority and is really trying to impose a specific interpretation of the world on the American South. This pattern of thinking is, I think, radically different from what we saw from the other two letter writers, Hughes and the other, simply because this is quite an extreme viewpoint. Rolly J. Tallman, who writes into the Atlanta Constitution as well, takes a much more arguably moderated stance. One could think of it as a more classically conservative look at things, and that he believed that as a taxpayer, he had tolerated the events at Little Rock, but the launch of Sputnik came as a shock. Why was the United States spending all of this money at Little Rock, a needless expense in Tallman's words, when that money could instead be spent on a worthwhile project such as missile development? Tallman is not inferring that the Eisenhower administration is trying to subjugate the South, but he is demonstrating his own belief that civil rights is not something he values or sees as a major concern. Rather, it's a distraction from the true issues of the Cold War. What I hope these examples have shown then is that the oft-repeated crisis narrative may not accurately encompass the diversity of American views present at this time, particularly as it often relies on fear being the driving emotion. While fear and shock are certainly reflected in these examples, individuals do often try to strike a pragmatic or problem-solving tone. Klein's letter, for example, reveals that alternative options also existed. He wanted to offer a solution through disarmament, which minimizes, I think, fear and the threat of nuclear warfare, rather than what Gotcha advocated for, which was essentially an arms race. And it helps reveal to us that a race need not have been the immediate outcome. Collaboration at the start of the space race may have been an option, and this was something American scientists also pushed for. Likewise, contemporary concerns over civil rights and the role of government are reflected, sidestepping Sputnik as a crisis on its own terms and instead arguing that the real crisis is domestic. Sputnik was not necessarily a Soviet win in the view of these Americans, but instead could sometimes be seen as America's loss, America's race to lose, so on. But the risk we have if we accept the premise put forward by the notion of this crisis is that we start to limit our understanding of American responses, and we do risk perpetuating Cold War thinking. As I noted earlier, if we accept a crisis as something that's out of place in the temporal sequence, something that perhaps shouldn't have happened or wasn't expected, then we begin to imply perhaps that the United States was always destined to win the space race, or always destined to be ahead of the Soviet Union, something which I think in many ways is a rejigging of Cold War thinking. Emphasizing sources such as the letter to the editor helps shift our focus away from this institutional framing, which often risks perpetuating this thinking, and instead towards a more personal perspective. While we don't necessarily get a full picture of American society, we do see cracks in this dominant narrative that helps us see other conceptions of the world and really interrogate Cold War thinking instead of perpetuating it. Thank you.
It seems that Anki won't come, so let's call our presentation an end for now. So thanks, Tom Wilkinson, for his insight. Now let's open the floor for questions. Shall we start it with the audience in the conference room? I mean, two of you shall have some questions for each other, right? So shall we start with this? And then I'll go to the questions in the Q&A section, because I think our Zoom audiences need some time to type their question in, right? So shall we start with Tom Wilkinson? Hi, Tom.
Hi, cool. So I do have one or two questions regarding Amartya's talk, because I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fantastic, I think a really good insight into the end of the Cold War and the role that Gorbachev himself played. I really enjoyed the way you I've sort of noted it down here as you're talking about them as positive feedback loops, right? So there is this push against this totalitarian or the Soviet system in the Eastern Bloc. Gorbachev tries to resolve this by loosening restrictions, but of course all this does is lead to further unrest and so on and so forth until we really see all these, 1989 and the end of the Cold War. What I was wondering about was what you see, and you sort of mentioned it a little bit, but comparisons between this loss of faith in the Soviet system during this period and the loss of faith perhaps in the American style system today that we see, I think particularly that was mentioned in the keynote, but really distrust in modern institutions, the downfall of, I think, traditional media, and the parallels of what parallels do you see, what ones don't you see? And I've got another question, but what I might do, I'll let you answer that first before hopping into that.
No, thank you for that. That's an amazing question, actually. So there definitely are parallels there, I would say. And in particular, there is a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the ways in which our institutions here in the United States are able to, or I should say, unable to provide in a substantive way the needs for the people. And I think that the pandemic really exacerbated those tendencies. But what has been the case for much of the time since the Cold War, even, I mean, popularity or approval rating for Congress is in the single digits almost every election cycle, which is really remarkable to think of, how this body that is supposed to be a direct representation of our collective citizenry is viewed so incredibly negatively. So there certainly are parallels there. And I think that that's part of the issue with the argument to say that, we've reached the end of history, that liberal democracy is won, that the United States is won, because to your question, that's really not the case. There's a growing dissatisfaction with the way in which democracy has become bureaucratic and gridlocked in the United States. And so I think that then in particular, that really speaks to how we really history has come roaring back, essentially.
Cool, thanks. So that's, I think, a really good and insightful answer. The other question I had, though, I sort of jotted down here, and it's sort of in the theme of the conference. There's been, back and forth about a new Cold War, a Cold War 2.0 breaking out at the moment. And what are your thoughts on, I guess, on that? Will we look back on perhaps the period, the end of the Cold War and the Cold Peace, as we might call it, as a period of extended détente, and as a, maybe the modern period is a continuation of that old Cold War along new actors and new lines? Or is this perhaps a return to a more traditional, if you take the view of, say, Paul Kennedy, who wrote about the great powers back in the day, do we see perhaps a return to a great power style conflict with multiple polarities, the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the People's Republic of China, all, I think, occupying, if not superpower position, at least great power position?
Right, absolutely. I actually, and I'm not too happy with this answer, but I think it's a bit of both. I don't enjoy kind of towing the middle, but I do think it's a bit of both. And there are particular reasons why I say that. I think where it's perhaps the most similar, and why it's particularly important that recognizing the similarity is, you could make the case that ideologically there is a similar breakdown of arguments for and against capitalism, for and against democracy, and then a more centralized form of government. And so I think that is similar, and that while there are different actors, I think as democracies in Asia begin to rise, that there are different countries that contribute to this global ideological debate, taking form perhaps in the way in which each country is able to provide for their citizens. Then there also is the differences, and I think highlighted by the title of this panel, right? Science and technology, and the way in which technology, of course, and science obviously has changed dramatically, has improved and increased dramatically. And then to that point as well, the way we generally discuss the financial sector globally is also very different, right? The way, with the rise of Bitcoin, for example, right? The way that currency is discussed, I think that also has an impact that perhaps wasn't seen in the same way, of course, 30 years ago. But then again, I wouldn't discount the similarity having to do with the ideological debate, really between democracies, countries that are democracies and their ability to provide for their people, and countries that aren't, and the arguments that they make, saying we don't have this gridlock in our capital, we're able to put up new roads and bridges and hospitals immediately, right? While you guys are squabbling over nickels and dimes, over party votes, trying to win elections, etc. And so, yeah, no, but thank you. That's an amazing question. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. If I can ask you a question, I'm just curious if you could expound a little bit on generally your take on the way, obviously the Cold War defined as the Cold War because the USSR and the US never directly fought each other, but more indirect military contentions. Speaking, of course, to your whole project on Sputnik and on the space race, mentioning social contributions to the Cold War. Of course, the space race highlighting that, but even the ways in which sporting events at the time could really contribute to that social dynamic between the US and her allies, and the USSR and her allies. I was just curious to get your take on that and to discuss the importance of those factors, not just the geopolitical factors, strictly speaking.
Sure, I'll try and keep my thoughts sort of succinct. I think, and particularly a historian rather than say a political studies individual, so I'm coming at this from an historian's perspective, but what we see, I think particularly throughout the Cold War, is that while we have on the one hand this great, I think, ideological difference between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, we also have got, and it's, I think we see it in the late 80s, particularly during Reagan's term, the Yuri and Samantha letters, essentially this combination, or these children who are trying to basically be like, hey, to summarize, the Cold War is not that good, we could be friends, we could grow up together, that sort of thing. And early on in the Cold War, from what I've read, that sort of attitude, that definitely develops later. But we do see, I think, this difference of collaboration, or rather on the social side, or what people seem to think is that collaboration is an option, particularly in somewhere like the space race, which is where I'm sort of focused, is that, for example, both Sputnik and the American satellite, the first American satellite, are launched as part of the International Geophysical Year, which is meant to be an 18-month project for all nations throughout the world to really engage in scientific discussion, interrogation, and come up with strong scientific theories, and a way to really bring the world together in this post-war international order. And Sputnik's launch, of course, it held significance as the first satellite, and a lot of what Americans say is that it's not as important as theirs because theirs will have a lot more scientific good to it. So they play up this, I think, division between the two powers. But on the scientific front, scientists throughout, and this is in the media, presented in the media as well, scientists throughout the United States are very much into this idea of collaborating with the Soviet Union. The A.A. Gorbachevs, who is basically called the head of the Soviet space program at this time. Usually the Soviet Union is hiding that it's Sergei Korolev who is actually the head. So there's a lot of people who are the head of the space program, according to the American media, but who really aren't. But he and other Soviet scientists are actually visiting the United States at the time that Sputnik is launched. And what's really fascinating is what we see as news reports of basically American scientists inviting the Soviet science team to their various centers to get a sense of what they're doing with their satellite, what they're doing with their rockets, and actually engaging in, I think, cross-country, cross-ideological dialogue. The Soviet team actually goes, look, if you've got too much equipment here, we would happily take some stuff up on one of our satellites with one of our launches. And you really, I think throughout the Cold War, and this is often overlooked, but we really need to keep in mind that it's primarily the political elite who I think drive a lot of division. And there are, of course, elements that come through in American culture. You get a lot of Cold War sort of pulp fiction, which is very much influences the way people think. But on an actual personal level, and I think what some of these responses that I showed perhaps didn't do it as well, but there are others that you see where people are very, very clearly show that they actually do, if not respect the Soviet system and the Soviet people, at the very least indicate their own belief that there is, there's more to it than just this political debate. There are options to come together. And what we do see is that a lot of these events where people could come together, so for example, the Olympics do end up becoming politicized as the Cold War goes on. So you get boycotts of the Olympics. You get debates in regions like ice hockey. So you get a lot of events where it gets politicized, I think, by elite in both nations. But what we probably need more of is seeing how Americans themselves actually interpret these events and how they respond to them on a day-to-day level.
Thanks for this brilliant discussion. I actually have a question, but I'm going to save it later. So
we actually have loads of questions.
We have a lot of questions, questions from the Q&A bar. And let's first welcome Professor Cherry and George to ask a question.
Well, first of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Cherian, together with Kenneth and other colleagues in the school. I'm one of the organizers of the conference. So I'm watching you guys with great regret, right? Regret that the conditions don't allow you to be in Hong Kong physically. As you may have noticed from the call for papers, we actually allocated money for travel grants and so on. So it is really such a shame that we don't have the privilege of your company in person. You would, I think, have enjoyed interaction, not with us faculty, but certainly with our RPG students here in Hong Kong. So one day we hope that you'll be able to come to Hong Kong and meet with us. I have a couple of, I guess, more like comments. And first of all, Tom, I thought it was very interesting to me to see how the seemingly unrelated events, right, the Sputnik launch and civil rights disputes in the US were being linked rhetorically through letters to the editor. In a way, it's kind of reassuring, because we assume that this is a habit that is, of course, very common in today's social media. The way people always ride on news events to make points that they want to make anyway, right? And but I guess this has deep roots. This tendency from a sort of social movements perspective. It's interesting, I think, that indeed a seemingly objective set of facts can be framed in very different ways to advance different arguments. So I thought that was extremely interesting. Amartya, I thought the link between the civil rights movement and the space race, that there's actually more room, and the Cold War, right, has more room for elaboration, because I know one of the leading political sociologists who studied the civil rights movement, Doug McAdam, for example, after years of studying it and explaining the way the movement operated and so on, and he came to the conclusion that, in fact, it was external factors that might have actually tilted the balance, because the US was beginning to look so bad in the international community, in the world community, that this perhaps, as much as any other domestic pressure, might have actually provoked better behavior on the part of Washington, because we're just losing too much respect overseas, which then leads me to a question that I guess is for you to think about, because I think it's beyond what you're actually researching. Could the same thing happen today? Because I think it is equally true today that Chinese propaganda is absolutely milking the social turmoil, Black Lives Matter, and so on in the US today. Friends are getting those WhatsApp messages clearly churned out by the Chinese propaganda machine, saying that look at how hypocritical the West is when they talk about human rights and they talk about liberal democracy, but look at the way they're treating their own population and so on. Very much in the same way that Soviet propaganda was doing. So I think it's an interesting question to look at, perhaps in the conclusion of your paper, more speculative, right? Could a new Cold War have the same kind of positive impact on the behavior of elites in the US in the way that some historians and political sociologists say that it did have in the 1960s in the US? And if not, and I suspect the situation is not the same, that it won't actually have that impact. If not, why not? So it's just something to think about, not necessarily to answer now, but of course, if you have thoughts, please do share them.
We have several other questions. We have several other questions, actually. So it's a great, thank you, Cheriam, for that great feedback. And I'm sure both presenters have a lot to think about. And shall we go on with the questions, actually?
Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. Questions for Amartya. Fukuyama has frequently been accused for being an opportunist when using empirical data in his thesis. In few occasions, he cherry picks data to propose some of his shallow arguments, while on other occasions, he avoids the data altogether and comes up with abstract ideas. In other words, it has become apparent that Fukuyama's argument hold little to no weight when trying to understand war and peace in the past or present. What are your thoughts on this? And why do you give so much importance to his thesis in your argument?
Thank you for that question. I actually was not aware of those allegations when writing this paper, but I think either way, what I mean to do in using his thesis is really to sort of highlight the general conservative argument for U.S. foreign policy following the Cold War, and essentially to say that a policies of interventionism, the irony almost of trying to export self-rule in a lot of ways, right, is, well, I argue wrong. To say that history was that we'd reached the end of history was incorrect, and so I was not in any way aware of those allegations. But I still think what holds true is that that the line of argument proposed by not just Fukuyama but many in his ideological faction or cohort requires, I think, revision.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we also, yes, you can. Let's welcome our Professor Kenneth Polten to ask a question for that.
Hello, both of you. You can't see me, I guess. But hello, both of you. It's Kenneth Polten. I'm so happy to see you and to hear your wonderful presentations. I've got a question for Tom and then one for both of you in general. Tom, really appreciated your points and what you uncovered from those letters. And it straightway reminded me of two things, right? One was the film Hidden Figures, which was out a few years ago, which of course deals with these tensions between civil rights and kind of unifying as a nation against the perceived enemy. And the other thing, of course, the more recent Apple TV Plus series For All Mankind. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about what sort of work is being done for the contemporary public, right, a contemporary audience in making these types of works. What's it doing? So that's the particular question I have for you. The general question I have for both of you is, this is fantastic work that you're doing. I just wonder, where do you want to take your research in the next few years? What are some of the questions that you think you will be pursuing as a scholar? Thank you.
Cool. I suppose I'll answer my half first. A lot of these, and I think it's an interesting question you raised, the space historiography, as I've found, it's a funny beast because space in the space race is quite appealing to both academic and popular audiences. And so a lot of works exist that try to span both. And in doing so, you sometimes get facts that are perhaps overlooked or misinformation that is repeated. But again, these always do usually take this much more institutional or, scientist, in some cases, scientist first response. And what we see with the rise of, say, something like Hidden Figures is really an attempt to address some of these issues that have existed in the historiography about reframing the space race, looking at it through different lenses. You have similar with Lily Koppel's Astronaut Wives Club, which actually, rather than focusing on the astronauts themselves, looks at their wives and their social lives and how that was impacted by their husbands being these massive figures during the space race. And likewise, I think we see the rise of counterfactual such as For All Mankind, sort of really plays with this idea that we perhaps see a little more now, where people are pushing back against the notion that the United States won the space race. There's a lot of, I think, and you see a lot of memes of discussion, people being unsure whether we should count the moon landing as the victory point, when you look at the race and see so many Soviet successes early on, as well as Soviet successes after the moon landing. And it becomes, how do we think of the space race? How should we frame it? So I think that's sort of my thoughts on that. And in terms of future research, I'll just quickly jump into that. My sort of current plan is I'm in the middle of preparing PhD proposals here at Auckland to sort of further my research in this area. So looking at the space race between 1957 and 1967 and trying to get a sense of the various narratives and perspectives that are put forward during that time, and how do these shift over the period? Do we see greater criticism coming from individuals or politicians as we see the war in Vietnam ramp up, for example, or civil rights issues ramp up, and just seeing how the space race itself plays out, I think, in the American sphere domestically.
Thanks, Tom, for the response. And here we have questions for Amartya from Ruhu. Your presentation largely based on quotation from different people on Cold War that precede the end of USSR or USSR that couldn't survive Cold War. Is it safe to say Cold War ends with the end of USSR? And then you talk about squandering the benefit of Cold War by the US and the enigma of stigmatized the other parts of the world to prevail the supremacy. The first word. How do you analyze connects the Cold War and squandering chances of the US due to individualism and isolation you mentioned? What brings America to this? Now that you also mentioned it made the USA vulnerable as well, do you think the USA brings themselves purposefully where they are right now, or it's just a result of squandering chances to make things right?
Thank you for that question. To answer the first part, as to whether specifically, excuse me, whether the, let's see, I've lost the question here, I'm sorry. As to whether the USSR or the end of the USSR marked the end of the Cold War. I think I would actually say no. And I think this harkens back to, Tom, one of your questions about, do we see sort of some similarities between the ways in which growing in popularity from the satellite states versus growing in popularity in American government by the American people largely right now. And so I think that there are a lot of similarities both on that front in terms of kind of this disconnect between political, financial, governmental elite that I think Mr. George, your question highlighted as well as Tom's presentation, and then also differences or similarities, I should say, between the ideological similarity in where the debate lies today between many countries, to the point where it's really formed the ways in which major first world nations have allied with others and specifically allied against their labeled adversaries. For the second part of your question, I believe mainly had to do with how the two parts of the essay really connect, and if the U.S. is purposefully, if it's more their squandering of this cold peace era, as it's been labeled, more purposeful, or if it's kind of a mistake. That is really actually a fascinating question that I hope to research further, because I think that it highlights the changing dynamics, changing political dynamics nationally in the United States, diverging policy agendas of a more interventionist foreign policy versus a more isolationist foreign policy. And while in the past that difference may have been along party lines, I think that that's really switching. And I think President Trump's America First policy, if you will, although I don't know how policy rich it really was, really kind of heightens then a scrambling of how certain arguments aren't necessarily fitting in as neat of a partisan, as neatly in terms of partisanship. And so I think then that really gets to whether kind of the reasons behind why specifically the United States, for some administrations, wanted to be more hands-on and more aggressive, say in the Middle East, for example, over the last 20 years, as compared to their political opponents. And so I hope that was able to answer your question, and thank you for posing that. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Great. We have a few more questions in the
they keep
queue.
coming in, which is amazing.
Right. So here we have questions for Tom, which is from Emily. While there were distinctions between the South and North in attitudes towards Little Rock and the civil rights movement in the context of Sputnik, were there any distinction along the same boundaries in other attitudes? For example, disarmament and science.
That's a really interesting question. From my research, I didn't pick up on any of those, I guess, regional distinctions in the other fields of, say, science and disarmament. But there are, of course, distinctions, I guess, in similar ways. It's sort of scientists who are more closely affiliated with the United States government or with particular aspects of the government. So Wernher von Braun, who was associated with the army and their test range in Alabama at this time, he's incredibly critical of the American government for allowing them to basically be second, for allowing the Soviet Union to launch their satellite first. Von Braun, of course, becomes a major figure in NASA and is sort of a big role in getting the Saturn V rocket developed. So he does have personal reasons for thinking this. But he is, an example of a scientist who is he doesn't necessarily believe in collaboration with the Soviet Union at this time, but he also doesn't necessarily believe in collaborating with other branches of the US armed forces. There's a lot of argument between the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force about who's meant to be in charge of missiles. And von Braun believes he should be in charge of them all. So he's, one example. In terms of science, you do get scientists who come out against collaborating with the Soviets, but more commonly it's those are independent scientists or working for independent institutions, whereas you do also get a lot of scientists who are very pro-collaboration or quite excited. And it's one of those things, when the satellites launched, there's actually a meeting being hosted at a US embassy celebrating the Soviet scientists and their trip to the United States, and they get a phone call, and the news correspondent gets a phone call and basically announces, hey, look, the Soviets have put a satellite into space, and everyone there is cheering and sort of, raising their glasses. So you see those boundaries, but you see different attitudes, but not necessarily those same north-south boundaries.
Thanks for the answer. Also, we have another question for Tom. It's also from Ruhu. Dear Tom, on Sputnik or any other space research success, do you think any kind of space research success was not celebrated by everyone? For example, Sputnik's success started Cold War due to fear, anxiety, and technology gap between the states. Due to the perceived effect of persisting Cold War, or is this something else?
Yes, there's lots of examples, and I think Sputnik in particular, I think, there's a lot of, debate about it. And what we see a lot of, particularly as we head into the election season in the United States in the 1960 election, what you have is a lot of partisan attitude towards this apparent missile gap. So John F. Kennedy and other Democrats really campaign on there being a missile gap, as evidenced by Sputnik and other Russian successes through Sputnik 2 and further launches. And they keep arguing, oh, there's a missile gap, basically playing into this fear and playing into these Cold War attitudes. On the other side of that, you have Nixon and President Eisenhower, Nixon going for the presidency in 1960, who actually can't respond to this properly, because for them to say that there's not a missile gap would require them to reveal classified information about the United States' own reconnaissance satellite programs and U-2 flights that were being undertaken over the Soviet Union at the time. So on the one hand, you have those fears. As the Cold War progresses and as the space race progresses, you begin to see success, and particularly American success, I think gets criticized a lot. I noted the dominant narrative of this triumphalist narrative, but there's other narratives that historians have identified, such as criticism of the space race from the political left, as well as the political right. So there are critics of the space race as a whole, of success regardless throughout. So yeah, we do see all sorts, and sometimes it's Cold War fears, sometimes it's purely political, budgetary concerns.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And actually, I don't think we have much time for another questions, but we still have two in the queue. So probably I'm gonna forward this to you, and you're gonna answer them through email. So thanks for the brilliant conversation engaged by Tom and Amartya. So basically that's the end for this session. Please stay tuned for our next session on the conflicts, which focuses on all the conflicts around the world nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you so much.